Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to this parallel session on addressing corruption during and after COVID-19. My name is Frédéric Böhm. I'm working at the OECD Public Integrity Division, and I have the pleasure to be moderating the session today. Please note that interpretation in English, French, Spanish, and Italian is available. We all know that corruption is an impediment to sustainable and inclusive growth. It widens inequalities, impedes the effective delivery of public services, and undermines the value of democracy. If we are ready to leave no one behind and deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to promote integrity in governments, businesses, and societies. And corruption is not limited to SDG 16. Integrity is essential to implement effective policies in many sectors, including in health, education, infrastructure, and the environment. Making integrity a key part of governance is therefore vital to achieve progress in all SDGs. In the dialogue we have been having at the OECD with many actors and countries, it became very clear that COVID-19 crisis amplified and made very concrete the negative effects of corruption. The crisis exacerbated already existing structural weaknesses of governance system and added new ones. While at the beginning of the crisis, perhaps emergency procurement and access to health were the most pressing issues, and many times still are. Today, the focus perhaps shifted to issues related to the vaccine and to socio-economic recovery, with increased risk of undue influence in the allocation of funds, as well as fraud and corruption in social benefit programs, for instance. And crucially, corruption undermines trust in government, which in turn is vital for government's ability to respond to the crisis and to secure citizen support for the measures that have been taken. We know that this trust in government is driven by a perceived lack of integrity and a growing sense of unfairness. In fact, the Edelman Trust Barometer 2020 revealed that 57% of the general population say governments serve the interest of only a few, while only 30% believe governments serve the interest of everyone. So the success or failure of government interventions to address the crisis will also depend crucially on how governments are able to manage risks of corruption and undue influence and counter real or perceived unfairness. However, and we have heard it, I think, again and again recently, crises are also opportunities. The current conditions create an unprecedented need and demand for public accountability and efficiency. And so governments have an opportunity to undertake profound reforms addressing fundamental weaknesses of the integrity and governance systems, addressing corruption, and build resilience to better face consequences of the current crisis as well as future ones. As such, the session today will look back, asking, for instance, how COVID-19 response plans have paid attention to corruption, what governance and integrity weaknesses have been revealed, and what strides have been made to increase integrity, transparency, and accountability. But we will also look ahead and examine lessons from promoting coherent anti-corruption policies to see what changes do we need to make to be ready for the next crisis and address the current one. And we are delighted to have with us 4 experts who will be able to share with us their perspectives and visions on these questions. Mr. Jorge Bermudez Soto is since December 2015 the Controller General of the Republic of Chile, which is currently also the Executive Secretary of the OLACEFs. Mr. Bermudez is a lawyer with extensive experience in academia and working in public and private organizations. He has a Master in European Community Law, a PhD in Law from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, and was also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Gießen and Heidelberg in Germany. Welcome. Mr. Juan Pablo Guerrero is the Network Director of the Global Initiative on Fiscal Transparency, which is a multi-stakeholder action network integrated by ministries of finance, civil society organizations, and international financial institutions, with the goal to advance fiscal transparency, inclusive participation, and accountability. He has vast experience in public administration reforms for accountability, anti-corruption, and fiscal transparency. So welcome also, Juan Pablo. Mr. Ed Okede has 3 decades of experience working on governance issues around the world. He currently leads the World Bank Public Sector and Financial Management team in the Governance Global Practice team, so focusing on helping countries build capable, effective, accountable, transparent, and inclusive institutions that deliver citizen-centric services, facilitate private sector growth, and improve trust in government. And she has a wide experience also in many of the countries we are having audience from today. Mrs. Angela Mee is the chief of the research branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, where she oversees global, regional, and national research in the areas of drugs and crime. She's responsible, for instance, for publications such as the World Drug Report, the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, the Global Study on Homicide, and the World Wildlife Crime Report. She has also supported countries in promoting and improving their statistical and analysis system, for instance. So welcome to you all. In our first round of questions, I will ask some questions we have received from stakeholders to kick off the discussions. Everyone will have more or less 5 minutes to answer these questions and provide some first insights. And then in the second round, we will see, well, first of all, panelists will be able to react to some points raised by other speakers. And also we will be able to address some questions coming from the audience. So we encourage all you to write questions you have for the panelists by using the question and answer box. We will be keeping track and identifying similar questions to be able to address as many questions as possible. And towards the end of the session, we will have a final round for some closing remarks by our panelists to share some key messages. Now I spoke enough, and I will start with Mr. Jorge Bermudez. I will speak in Spanish and ask the questions also in Spanish, so you can use the translation. Señor Contralor, bienvenido. ¿Y cuál es el mandato que se desprende a partir de del objetivo de desarrollo 16 para las entidades fiscalizadoras superiores? ¿Y juegan ellas realmente un rol importante ahora? ¿Y cuál es? Y en particular, ¿cuál ha sido el rol de la Contraloría?
The Institute in Chile is very important. What has been the role of the Board of Auditors in the management of corruption during the pandemic? Maybe you can give us some suggestions or some lessons. Thank you, Frederick. I will be speaking in Spanish. As I said, I'm very happy to be here and happy to share this conversation with my colleagues and with Federico. I will answer the question, what is the role of the higher audit institutions, the superior audit institutions? We've always thought that these institutions should have a control over financial activities of states. Instead, for some time now, these institutions have become part of a system for fighting corruption. That is the way we see their role in Chile. In terms of the sustainable development goals, well, this entails the establishment of sound justice, and we feel that these institutions can play a very significant role. But this isn't something the UN has said. This is the view also of the Organization of Superior Audit Institutions. It has been said that they can provide independent external control over the achievement of the goals envisaged by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So it is part of our mandate to see how governments are seeking to reach these goals. What have we done in practice? Already in June 2016, a short time after the approval of the 2030 agenda. And through the Foreign Ministry, we had asked the government what was going to be done to achieve these goals. We also pointed out that it was important to take into consideration the Board of Auditors and the role that it would play in the achievement of these goals. We have identified 3 objectives in connection with the Sustainable Development Goals. The first objective is to reduce corruption in all its forms. This has become a strategy for us, and it means that our work needs to be aligned in promoting public integrity. What the Superior Audit Institution needs to do is to aim towards this goal. As to SDG 16, in terms of transparent and effective solutions, we believe, as an independent body that doesn't belong to any party, we're a technical body, we believe we can provide objective information that can be useful in the decision-making process of the state administration. And we will be able also to express strategic opinions and offer a contribution to good administration. SDG 16 refers also to public access to information, and we believe that working with data, we can be a data-driven organization. We can give information to everyone, to citizens as well. And what has been our role in the fight against the pandemic? How did we meet this challenge? It's fair to say that we were able to use technologies in our work in the past 14 months. So this is very important. First of all, we've been able to very quickly transform ourselves. We were an organization that worked in offices, but we have now been working from home. We took advantage of this opportunity offered by technology. And through access to databases, we are now able to do 90% of our audits. We do know that corruption never goes on holiday or is not quarantined during a pandemic, and the Board of Auditors has used technologies precisely to track corruption where it has emerged. We have also been able to supervise the aid provided to society and monitor the beneficiaries. And we've also been able to keep track of the pandemic, how many people had been infected, how many people had died because of the pandemic, how many were ill. And we have also been able to make very significant purchases that counter the pandemic. We're talking about $1,500 billion during this period, and 90% of the contracts, we need to remember, were awarded without any tendering. Now, this doesn't mean that there was necessarily corruption, but it certainly did pose a risk. And we continue to work with the means available to us. We have healthcare and all the means that have been adopted to counter the pandemic. I think that in terms of the lessons that we've learned, we can say that, first of all, we've learned that we live in a very uncertain world. We don't know how long the pandemic will last. We don't know what the future will bring. And in addressing this uncertainties, we need to have adaptability. And also, we need humility. Nobody has the right answer to all the questions. I think that the pandemic has shown that everyone has had to react. A lot of mistakes have been made. Also, the Chilean state has made mistakes, as have others. There have been regions that did well at the start and then found things more difficult at a later stage. We need to be humble and we need to accept that we can make mistakes. That's all I wanted to say for the moment. Thank you.
Very interesting point. Also remembering that no country really escapes from this challenge. You mentioned the relevance of data. I think this is a point we will come back also during the discussions. In data analytics, the challenge of teleworking and adapting, especially the auditing part, not to the new context. Your focus on the control of funds and the implementation of measures dedicated to addressing the COVID-19. And yes, we are living in a very uncertain world, and definitely we need to adapt. I will now pass to Mr. Juan Pablo Guerrero. I wanted to ask you the following questions that have been sent to us. What have been the principal challenges in terms of maintaining transparency and accountability during the current crisis? And in your experience, have COVID-19 response plans and government measures paid attention to anti-corruption so as to ensure that resources reach the right people, and in particular the most vulnerable groups?
Thank you very much, Frederic, and thank you to the rest of the panels. I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. It is an honor for me to, from the GIF perspective, contribute to these very important questions. Emergency fiscal responses pose significant transparency and accountability challenges, particularly in countries whose underlying legislation, processes, and systems aren't equipped to deal with emergencies. We have witnessed drastic budget reallocations and substantial additional spending that will impact fiscal sustainability for many generations to come. In many cases, spending has been done chaotically, behind closed doors, sometimes through the creation of extra budgetary funds and outside of trusted procurement systems. Close to 50% of contracts in Mexico federal government were allocated directly in 2020 without opening bidding processes. And we just learned that that amount is 90% in Chile. What a challenge, Contralor Bermúdez. Movement restrictions have reduced the potential role of crucial oversight actors, among others, legislators and Supreme Audit institutions. The pandemic adverse effects on public health, education, labor, and income have meant that decades of gains for women and other minorities have been lost. The development set the backdrop for an open, paving the way for long-lasting corruption, increased inequality, and poverty. Many international development stakeholders have been working hard to help countries face such challenges as this SDG 16 conference demonstrates. The GIF network developed a guide on the transparency and accountability of COVID-19 fiscal responses, including a consolidated list of data needs. And we have also, following some country efforts, observing many encouraging responses. For instance, to track spending not covered by information systems, countries such as Benin, Honduras, and Rwanda have used innovative tracking mechanisms. Others, like Sierra Leone, created dedicated funds with robust accounting and reporting standards. For transparency, our topic, Colombia, France, Honduras, Peru publish information on dedicated transparency portals. Emergency good practices include publishing a comprehensive overview of the COVID response, like in the Philippines, showing cross-sectional information such as in Brazil, and allowing open microdata access such as in Paraguay and the United States. Others, like Jordan, Papua New Guinea, Ecuador, Kenya, Kyrgyz Republic, and Nicaragua also publish information on procurement contracts, including on beneficial ownership. On oversight, as we just heard, Chile, Honduras, Peru, Sierra Leone, the US, South Africa, supreme audit institutions undertake real-time audits trying to uncover irregularities as they happen. Regarding reaching out, to your second question, Frederick, so regarding reaching out to vulnerable groups, amazing progress has been made with digital innovative tools. Togo launched Novici, a social assistance program providing emergency cash assistance to the poorest families. The government quickly built and deployed a completely contactless digital system that was able to provide cash to 500,000 individuals. Few have, however, been able to simultaneously address the health emergency, economic downturn, and social impact. Now, public engagement has made a significant difference in somewhat mitigating this. CSOs have been contributing and supporting emergency policies, fulfilling the roles of advocacy, contestation, investigative journalism, and bottom-up leadership, to name a few. GIF produced a scoping document on the role of CSOs in pandemic responses. CSOs and the media have aided oversight, facilitated data availability, and complemented government efforts. In South Africa, volunteers disseminated procurement data on Keep the Receipts platforms. The Latin American Journalist Network, Red Palta, published articles tracing overpricing and corruption in medical equipment procurement. In Chile, Fundación Observatorio Fiscal analyzed controversial sanitation and hospital equipment procurement. In other cases, including ASIG in Argentina, INESC in Brazil, IBP in South Africa, Nigeria, and Senegal, CSOs has been instrumental in broadening and improving policy and implementations, raising inclusion and inequality considerations. So I'll conclude with a few takeaways. One, transparency. Open, systematic, and monitor processes have improved policy implementation, so we should keep pushing in this direction. Two, checks and balances and civic participation. Stakeholder engagement have facilitated resource allocation and policy implementation. And third, digital innovations and tools have been critical in facilitating all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and especially also learning about all these innovative ways to adapt and to track funds, for instance, and spending in such diverse countries. You have also mentioned the relevance of digital tools and data, and perhaps something we can talk about in the next round is also the issue of trust in this information and how to promote the trust that is provided by the governments. I think that's a really interesting overview, and the key takeaway points I think are very well taken, and we will come back to them as well. Mr. Ed Olowo Okere, turning now to you, what are the principal obstacles in your view to an effective and coordinated international action to address corruption and corruption, in particular in the context?
Thank you, Frederick. Given that corruption is a serious impediment to development in many countries, I'm delighted to participate in this session. I would like to begin by noting that during a crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic, we expect humanity to focus its efforts exclusively on tackling the crisis. Unfortunately, some saw this pandemic as an opportunity to amass wealth, and that resulted in multiple cases of corruption reported across the globe. It is important, however, to remind ourselves that corruption is an age-long problem. So even before COVID-19, the need for international coordination to control corruption risks was clear. And why is that? First, the ease of moving money means that the policies of one country impact others. Second, some countries' rules on business registration, like anonymous companies, lack of criminalization of foreign bribery, and other issues can facilitate large-scale corruption. Now, we have seen progress in international cooperation already. And examples include the OECD Convention on Combating Bribery of Foreign Public Officials in International Business Transactions. Another example is the UN Convention Against Corruption. Now, these agreements commit signatory countries to take certain actions, such as the criminalization of foreign bribery, prevention measures, asset recovery, and more. Coordinated action by the international community is possible, but more is needed, especially in handling safe havens and anonymous company structures that can facilitate corruption. Now, with respect to the specific obstacles to effective and coordinated international action, a number of obstacles that I can identify. One is interest groups that benefit from the status quo and lobby to keep it. This has long been a reason for anonymous company structures, which can even be a business model for a country or a jurisdiction. This can lead to a race to the bottom in terms of setting up legal structures that facilitate corruption, tax evasion, and other wrongs. Another obstacle is practical difficulties due to differences in laws and legal cultures among countries. For example, varying legal practices and structures can make international investigations and asset recovery process cumbersome and challenging. These challenges are even larger for poorer countries, which may have little capacity for working through requests for mutual legal assistance. Now, we have to appreciate that COVID-19 did not create these problems, but only put them in the spotlight. Despite the challenges, international collective action is possible, and there is currently momentum to strengthen, for instance, beneficial ownership transparency and safe havens and anonymous company structures, among other things. There are also efforts to ease the difficulties with asset recovery. Now, let me conclude my intervention by providing a few examples from the World Bank perspective. The World Bank is assisting countries in improving the transparency of their corporate sectors, making it easier to determine who owns and controls corporations. This includes work assisting offshore and international incorporation centers like Seychelles and Panama. It also includes improving the transparency of the corporate sector, which we are working with Pakistan on, and support to countries to establish beneficial ownership regimes and boost tax-related exchange of information, as we are doing in Ecuador, Peru, and Nigeria. Yeah. And also publishing beneficial ownership guides provided by financial centers through the STAR website. Also, the World Bank is participating in international fora that help countries toward common standards and agreement of common problems, including with UNODC, the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, the OECD Anti-Corruption Task Team, and others. Finally, Given UNODC's role in the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, it is very critical to facilitating international actions to combat corruption. So the role of the UNODC is critically important. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you very much. I think you highlighted very well the need for international coordination because of the boundary effects of both policies and corruption. The transnational aspects of bribery, beneficial ownership, and asset recovery don't stop where the country ends, but often has a regional implication. I will now move to Angela. There's a question about how member states have taken advantage of the synergies between different actors and tools to advance more integrated approaches to exposing and preventing corruption after COVID-19. And in Europe, from your perspective, how has corruption linked to the COVID-19 pandemic affected different groups in society, including women and vulnerable groups? And do we have the evidence to say that?
Thank you, Frederick, and good afternoon to everyone from Vienna. And I think it's a nice link from the last speech from the World Bank, to say the critical role of UNODC. So I much appreciation for recognizing the role of UNODC. So I will start from your question, because I think earlier there's been a lot of country example discussed. So if you don't mind, I will start maybe a bit at a higher level in terms of the COVID, maybe to add something that others have not mentioned already. And to bring the perspective of thinking about corruption and analyzing the risk of corruption, the higher risk that COVID has brought to corruption. And particularly I'm thinking about the ground corruption and the way how criminal groups use corruption to really infiltrate the illicit economy, and how the incentives for the recovery that all governments in the world are delivering, how this is an advantage in a way for criminal organization to infiltrate the legal economy through corruption. And that so emphasizes that, so that the impact is not only the impact of corrupted behaviors, but also a much larger impact of corruption is when legal economy, if you will, is created by illegal profits and so undermine development in general, social and economic. And so in terms of the pandemic, I think, earlier, I think from Chile, Jorge was saying, well, we have to think about we have to be very adaptable. And one group that is always very adaptable are criminal groups. And in fact, we have seen on how during the COVID, they have very adapted, and they were the first in taking advantage of the situation to trying to exploit loopholes that the COVID and the pandemic has brought. And so, and particularly when I'm talking about the infiltration in the legal economy, I think it's important that we identify few economic sectors to monitor closely for corruption. And these economic sectors are the one that, in a way, are the one that suffer most from the pandemic. I'm talking about retail and marketplace, for example, tourism and hospitality, transportation, and all the business of entertainment. These are the really sector where they have a desperate need of cash that the criminal organization or other organization can easily give in order to infiltrate the legal economy and benefit from the large financial profits that the governments are given to recovery from the pandemic. But there are also other economic sectors that is important to follow and to monitor closely, again, for the loopholes that they could be for them to enter, to use corruption, for undermining the legal economy. And these are the economic sector where actually they're blooming because of the pandemic. And so, for example, the sector of logistics and e-commerce, food retail trade, wholesale trade in medical products or wholesale trade in pharmaceutical products. These are all sectors that are growing very fast during the pandemic, and where there will be criminal organizations that will want to invest in these sectors, and definitely will be subject to corruption. So how government, so this is the, if you want, the alarm that we as also UNODC has brought even early last year during the pandemic to say, you know, what we need to monitor carefully, and then how to overcome the risk of higher corruption and infiltration of the legal economy. So how, and for example, one of the things that we have highlighted also from the start was the risk of using corruption to overcome the inaccessibility of vaccines. And we see it now happening with an unregulated, or if you want, an unequal accessibility that different communities and different states have around the world to the vaccine, on how this again becomes a gap that can be fill with corrupted behaviors, so corrupted in all chain of the communication institution, and then with corruption give privilege access to vaccine to certain people or community, but also overall in the wholesale. And so not only affecting individual people, but also talking about, again, large economic sectors on how corruption can, you know, in a way undermine the equal distribution of important goods like the vaccine. How countries have addressed this risk of increased corruption? And I have to say, if I have to list about in a few broad ways. One, some countries, if you want, they were already resilient because they already had in place anti-corruption tools and framework that were able to address the risk of corruption. And so, for example, you know, with very strong auditing in place, for example, Gabon, where they have that all emergency funds received, for example, from the IMF, are subject to an audit within 6 months of when there is the receiving of the funding. But also with monitoring, and again, something that was already existing before, so that it was a mitigating factor when the pandemic came. And then, for example, another example of monitoring is in Peru, where the Supreme Audit Institution created a COVID-19 health emergency control strategy and used existing knowledge to verify the acquisition and distribution of essential product. In other countries, there has been the creation of emergency legislation, and so new legislation to deal with the COVID-19 pandemics. And so, for example, if I may talk about from Austria, since I'm sitting in Austria, there has been to respond and to protect, if you want, the response of the pandemic of the government, they established also a Ground Audit Act, where all COVID-19 grants disbursed from the hardship fund that they have created to alleviate financial challenges or related short-term employment assistance, they must undergo a retrospective audit to confirm the accuracy of the data submitted by grant beneficiaries. In other cases, there has been ad hoc solution in terms of ensuring that public procurement of emergency medical supplies and services were still met because of the urgency, but at the same time creating some strategy in order to avoid corrupting loopholes. And then, for example, in Colombia, they use a pre-registering suppliers list in order to deliver this urgency reliefs for the community. And then, but it was already mentioned earlier, we have seen in many countries the use of technology and open data to prevent corruption entering in the response to COVID. And I don't go in the details because this was already mentioned. To conclude, I think I want to answer, Frederick, to your question on who is most affected by corruption, that a possible increased risk of corruption due to COVID. And here I just wanted also to mention the different experience that women and men have in corruption, and how this possibly may have exacerbated also during the pandemic. And I wanted to mention the latest research that we have done in Nigeria, where we really have analyzed using a survey of almost 40,000 households in Nigeria, understanding how the people experience corruption there. It's clear that men are more affected by corruption than women. So about 35% of men pay the bribe when they access a public service, while only about 24% of the female. And in terms also of from the government perspective, also female government officials are less likely to engage in corruptive behaviors than men. A police officer, a male police officer, is almost 5 times more likely than a female police officer asking to ask a bribe during his official duty. But what and so in that the COVID is unlikely that has changed these patterns. But where the COVID may have exacerbated the vulnerability of women is on what we call the use of body as a currency. And while we don't have enough data to describe the extent of this problem, because there is the difficulty of people to release this information. We know that when we interview the Nigerians, 40% of both men and women said that the use of body currencies, so basically to pay bribes with sex favors, is extensively frequent in a country like Nigeria. And so with the increased vulnerability of marginalized population and increased vulnerability because of COVID also of women, this is likely to have exacerbated this the vulnerability also for women that they have nothing else than have their body to be sold to pay a bribe to have to access the public service. So with that, I'll just looking forward for the next round and back to you, Frederick.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you for this broad overview. And I think I really found the research you mentioned on Nigeria. It really shows that understanding the context is really important to tailor policy responses in a more effective way. Understanding, for instance, who is actually in contact with public service delivery explains who will be also more likely to be victimized. So that's definitely an issue, and not forgetting that bribery is not only about money, it's also very important, especially from this extortion issue. So I would like to invite again participants to ask questions through the chat box. But in the meanwhile, perhaps I'm asking the panelists whether they would like to react perhaps on some things that have been said by another speaker, would like to complement it from their perspective concerning some of the issues we mentioned, for instance, the use of IT and data analytics, or the question, what really makes a country resilient? What have been the lessons we have learned by this context that shows us where are these vulnerabilities that have been uncovered? Perhaps.
Me. Oh, Jorge, whatever.
Yes, please.
Thank you. One area in which I perceived common traits or tendencies are related to what you mentioned at the very beginning, Frederick. also opportunities. I think that we have all shared incredible ways, adaptabilidad, said Jorge Bermúdez, incredible ways in which institutions, processes were able to continue doing what they were supposed to, in spite of, if you want, a broader and more profound challenge regarding corruption or lack of transparency. There, as you mentioned, also the role of innovative technology tools have been crucial. I also believe that it's a combination of these tools and access to these tools to civil society and other stakeholders. It is there where I believe that this crisis has become an opportunity to really reveal the importance of not only strong institutions, checks and balances, but the role of the public in general. So that's one observation that I wanted to make. And the other one also related to opportunities regard really a broad, profound discussion about the social contract. Not in all countries, but in many countries, there is a very important discussion about new ways for development where inclusion and basically redistribution for better equality is a very important factor. And in all of these discussions, fighting corruption is at the center of the equation. So again, I wanted to underline that in many cases we see, in spite of horrible things that we are witnessing at personal level and at society level, we see areas of opportunity and hope.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. I think, Jorge, you wanted also to, yes, please.
Thank you, Frederick. I will speak in Spanish again, but no, since we have a translator system, of course, we have to use it. No, quiero decir que quiero tomar las palabras en primer lugar, tanto de Juan Pablo ahora y lo que dijo antes Ed, en el sentido de que es necesaria una coordinación internacional para la acción.
What I said earlier, it's very important to have state-level control to intervene on the communities, both in single countries and internationally, because the corruption is not something that only affects the public sector and relations with private enterprises. We need to persuade the public and the private sector and civil society that it needs to really fight corruption. This trilogy is fundamental. It is impossible otherwise to fight corruption. I have to say that in Chile, we've had a really good experience. We have set up the Anti-Corruption Alliance, and we did this already 9 years ago with the UN, or under the aegis of the UN Convention Against Corruption. We have established an alliance also with the Superior Audit Institution or other institutions involved in the fight against corruption, the Council for Transparency, and the bodies in charge of public procurement. Other NGOs, Chile Transparente, for example. Also, we have involved the representatives of business or banking associations. And I really think that this is a good example, because the suggestions that have emerged from this alliance are extremely sound and can be useful in eliminating corruption and achieving sustainable development goals. Without an alliance, without an international collective action, we shall not be able to pursue this goal. I really appreciated what Angela said in terms of the criminal groups. Clearly, they adapt much more quickly. I absolutely agree with what I said. Let's say that corruption is like coronavirus. So they are the mutant expressions, but the institutions don't change as fast. So to go back to Frederick's question, how to get a more resilient global administration, I think that the most important thing we need to learn is flexibility. We need to adapt to the new challenges, the challenge of the pandemic, the challenge that will be linked to economic recovery, and then the challenges raised by corruption in all shapes and forms. Criminals learn quicker to learn. I like this idea. I like this reference to the importance of promoting a system, and it shouldn't be active on a case-by-case basis. I think this is a fundamental dimension, the alliance of institutions, because an institution alone cannot deal with this problem.
The single case, going beyond the single case. And okay, it's an issue of culture, as you said, but I would say also more from, if you want, the research and the idea of, monitoring the risk. Look at more strategically, is also understanding corruption, not to describe what is happening today, but to have, since you mentioned earlier, the issue of data and analytics, to start, thinking about corruption, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about what are the dynamics that will happen and that they are going on. And that's why I mentioned, for example, to think about what are the sectors that will be most affected. And you say, yes, what are the vulnerable population that will be most affected? I think that's is very important because as I think you have said, the context is so important, and even from and I see here on these two levels, from one side to understand it from a business of, I call it ground corruption for whatever, I know that doesn't mean anything, but just to give an idea to those that, and the corruption that affects the single person every day to go to school, etc. And we have seen in every country, the vulnerabilities is in different places. When we went to look and analyze in Afghanistan, we saw in a few years emerging the educational sector become among the most corrupted sector. In the Balkan countries, the most corrupted sector, again, affecting the population, is the health sector. If you go to Africa, you see that the sector that is most affected is the judiciary. So I think it's important that, as you say, going beyond the edge case, but to see it more strategic and to understand where the risk is more higher, so that we can have direct and more critical intervention. And just to close, of course, the international cooperation, as Jorge has mentioned, is crucial. And I also want to mention the upcoming, in few weeks, the UN General Assembly on corruption. So that will be the next opportunity where we have that all countries can discuss again how together to fight corruption.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. The context really reflects the idea of having a risk-based approach to integrity policies. Ed, I saw you also wanting to speak. Please.
Okay, thanks, Frederick. So I would just like to make a couple of points. The first one is really about what makes a country resilient. And I would like to complement what Mr. Pablo said earlier on. I think strong institutions are very important. And when I say strong institutions, it's not just only public institutions, but also social actors like the civil society organizations. Now, in countries where you have strong institutions, then I think the things have worked reasonably well. It's been possible to be able to really mitigate the risk of corruption properly. Now, let's give examples of some countries where, for instance, supreme audit institutions are independent. Then it means they are able to go and audit. They can audit anything they want to audit and be given access to that. But we see, for instance, countries where supreme audit institutions have been prevented from having access to records about the response to the pandemic, and they've been able to audit that. Okay, so that kind of situations can make a country to be less able to deal with the issues. Then also where civil society organizations are really very active and they can ask questions and really make government accountable. I think this is very good for our countries. The second point I want to touch on is the issue of corruption and the impact on trust in government. As we know, a lot of countries have issues currently with trust in government going down. Now, this has serious impact. I mean, we saw some of the impact during the, at the onset of the pandemic, where, for instance, government response were impacted. For instance, due to lack of trust in government, you find situations where citizens are not necessarily fully complying with measures that are necessary to contain the pandemic. Currently, you must have heard about various misinformation and information in various countries that due to distrust in government, some people are not getting vaccinated, okay? Again, that is affecting the effort of the government to be able to really manage the crisis and contain the pandemic. So I think one thing is really very important, among many other things, transparency and free flow of information. And on top of that, for institutions of government to be fully accountable. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. And I think this issue of creating trust through information, through transparency, also to counter this false information of fake news in social networks that are undermining government response is key. But there's a vicious cycle, no? To trust the information provided by the government, there need to be trust in government. So it's really a work that has to be sustained by the government. Senor Contralor, I have a question for you from the audience. You have touched briefly on the use of IT in the Contraloría, in data. Could you explain a bit more what you have done concretely and what have been the results?
Ok, gracias, Frederick. Bueno, nosotros tenemos un plan estratégico en la Contraloría y estamos tratando de mover nuestras funciones y tratar de convertirnos en una data-driven organization, como dije antes. O sea, tratar de usar lo más intensivamente posible la tecnología. ¿Por qué? En primer lugar, porque es obviamente hacia donde se mueve el mundo, obviamente, ¿no?
And why are we doing this? Well, because this is the direction the world is going in, but also from a practical standpoint, it's very important. The Chilean Board of Auditors would find it difficult otherwise to have more resources. So we don't have financial autonomy, in fact. So the best way of using resources has been to invest these resources in technology. This has made it possible to set up a database that deals above all with two things. There's one unit that prepares and puts together the database and another unit that guarantees the access. So we have our own database here, but we also have access to other databases belonging to other state institutions. We analyze the data, and this enables us to direct our work, our activities. It enables us to identify risks. For example, as regards procurement and purchasing with the pandemic has been a great risk. We have had to buy all the tests, and we need to check on everything, check on old people's homes and all the different services provided. Clearly, this tool cannot replace the auditor, but it is very useful in providing more specific information. Otherwise, we're searching through too many data, basically. It enables us to select the right ones. It's a matter of persuading our officials that digitization is the way to the future, but we also need to train state officials. They need to be able to manage these systems. And it's also a question of persuading them that nobody's going to lose their job or nobody's going to be left behind technologies. And this has been our decision. With the support of the World Bank a couple of years ago, that the World Bank aided in this technological transformation. But the government accepted the suggestions that we had offered. And in the light of the work we did last year, we have realized that this is a very effective tool.
I saw that you have also ample experience in statistical work. And UNODC has launched guidance on elaborating corruption surveys to measure the SDG 16. And at the OECD, we are currently working on indicators to measure different components of an integrity system. And I wonder do you believe that the crisis has evidenced the need for better evidence, or is this wishful thinking? And where do you see some promising new approaches in measuring and monitoring integrity anti-corruption policies?
Thank you, Frederick. That's an interesting question from and then if you don't mind, then Amanda, can I also ask a question to one of the panelists? Yeah, and I was also reflecting when Jorge was talking about data. I was thinking, what data? I want to say, is it and corruption is such a complex and multidimensional that it's always hard. We cannot take one picture and understand it all. And so we need to always have this little thing. So as you said, what we have done, and with the OECD, and you're actually doing also a lot of good work, we are starting with one piece and say, okay, let's see how we can understand the experience of the population of a business. So we have developed guidelines on how to collect data through household and business services. So to look at understanding from that side of those that are accessing public service, their experience. But clearly, this is one piece, an important piece, because particularly in relation to the SDGs, because this is a piece that can help us to understand how corruption undermines the education, the health, all the other goals. But the big challenge now, how do we do with the rest? And is it possible to think about, can we measure the rest? That's, I think, at least we haven't found the answer yet. And who has found it would be nice to hear it. What we are trying now to do is to launch a process, an expert consultation on a framework, what we call a statistical framework. We don't want to call it a framework. I mean, a statistical framework with the idea that we understand that is a complex, so something that we try to, again, measure piece, but also to think about the links between different aspects. And so that's also because it's something that the member states have asked us at the last COP, that they wanted to, to see this new framework. So we will endeavor into this new process, but we're very much aware of the challenge, and we are very much aware. So any feedback that you can have, that would be very helpful. So if I may, can I ask a question to Mr. Olowo Oker? Sorry for mispronouncing your name. But you mentioned what makes a resilient a country to corruption, and And we often also in research, you know, sometimes we get this question, what is the things that works best in reducing corruption? Is including whistleblower makes a difference, or to, you know, to have audit make a difference, etc. And what at least some of research have shown is that there is not possible to establish the effectiveness of single you know, action or single institutions to corruption. But most often what seems to make the difference is the combination. You know, for example, whistleblower without a free press doesn't work, or etc. So I just wanted to hear your take on this, because what you describe is the perfect combination. But we know that we live in the perfect world. So yeah, we just wanted to hear your view.
Thank you. I think you asked the question and you answered the question as well. So that's the interesting part of it, because as you were asking, my response was going to be really, you don't have there is no magic wand, okay, to tackling corruption. If there were to be a certain tool that can effectively be used to do that, I think then we will not have the problem we are having with corruption. I mean, and with corruption surfacing almost in every country around the world, okay? I think given how long we have been with this problem, okay, of corruption, and the efforts that have been made, for instance, in terms of putting in prevention measures, looking at other aspects like the judiciary and so on and so forth, and how much impact we have had, really, what will be necessary is for us to completely open our minds and look at all the available tools, okay, and just try to put all of this together and then assume that in some countries they are going to work. And even when we put all of these tools together, in some countries they are not going to work, okay? So like the example you gave, okay, if you have a whistleblower, yeah, even if you have information, yes, but what if the justice system doesn't work? Okay, what if the justice system works, but then the justice system also allows for public officials, for instance, the president or the governor, to pardon, okay, people who have been found guilty by the courts, okay? So you can go on and on and on. But I think one thing is going to be really very fundamental, okay? And that is the people, the citizens, okay? I think in a number of countries, if you look at, I mean, you look around the world, where the citizens have just sat back and expect that this problem will solve itself, I don't think the problem is going to go away. I think we need strong involvement from citizens, okay? And they can deal with this in a number of ways. Asking questions, also being able to vote governments out. That is where there is free election, but we know that even where there is no election and you can have a movement of people, they can force a change in the democratic situation. So we really, I think a lot of this is going to depend on people. Of course, there is also the efforts by the international community as well. Both, I mean, because in a number of cases, we have looked at the issue of corruption as a domestic national issue, whereas you have facilitations taking place from outside of the country. So a lot of, I mean, so we need the citizens, we need the international community, we need the professionals, we need everybody, we need all the tools, okay? So that would be my response.
Yes, and a very good one. I would perhaps just, yeah, also the fundamentals, no? The civil service, a strong civil service. You mentioned elections, political finance, where we know that often corruption starts at this stage. No? So, but definitely there's no magical solution. Juan Pablo, I have a question for you, and perhaps also Jorge can complement. And you raised your hand also, but let me just quickly my question, and then you can address both. We are seeing that there are significant amounts of money, public money, that will be spent, that are being spent and will be spent in the future. Also, for instance, for the development of vaccines, even so going to the private sector. And then we have, let's say, a lot of worries and opacity also in contracting of vaccines and all this. what good practices have you seen emerging during the crisis? And auditing, for instance, may come late when things have already happened. How can we ensure a more timely control over the public spending? Have you seen some good experiences, some good practices?
Yes, thank you. And it relates very much to the reason why I raised my hand, because of the way Ed finished his last intervention, putting the emphasis on the role of the people. We've been working for many years on transparency issues, and we've seen many of these efforts suddenly disappear, and no one claiming or no one having any regrets about it. What makes the difference, or what makes these transparency efforts to be sustainable? Well, as said, when people are part of the equation, when they own the process. In other words, if you want, for instance, a fiscal transparency portal, not only to be used, but to last even when governments come and go, engage the users, make the users part of the process. And this is where I still believe the international development community still has a challenge. We come to countries, we work very strongly, we engage deeply with civil society counterparts, and very rarely we have around the table the users, the beneficiaries, civil society. And it's not only inviting them, informing them, and then having them part of the inauguration cocktail. It's really working with them. It's also giving them technical assistance and institutional capacity, so on and so forth. So I wanted to underline that is a challenge that I still see. Now, on your very specific question, again, whenever you have this wonderful combination, not only of transparency, but investigative journalism, public servants that are honest, willing eventually to cooperate with investigative journalists, and then civil society who is willing to stand up to corruption that is hurting them personally, and sometimes with drastic, terrible, fatal consequences. That's where very, very quickly you see the government facing a very strong pressure to act in a good way. And I would say that in the procurement and the vaccine process that you mentioned, the role of, again, transparency with a civil society that is assuming it's vigilante, it's independent, if you want, unofficial control of monitoring is absolutely crucial. When civil society is quiet, corruption blossoms.
Sí, Jorge.
Sí, gracias, Frederick. Yo quisiera responder tu pregunta, la que le hiciste a Juan Pablo, en el sentido de, bueno, así lo entiendo yo, ¿cómo hacer que la auditoría no llegue tan tarde, ¿no? Porque la auditoría llega cuando ya está todo hecho, la corrupción ya se consumó, ya hubo corrupción, y vamos a llegar solo a constatar algo que ocurrió en el pasado. Yo no tengo una respuesta que sea una bala de plata y que sirva para todos. Solo te puedo decir cómo lo hicimos nosotros, cómo lo estamos haciendo nosotros. ¿Cómo lo hemos hecho? Usando tecnología, obviamente.
We've used technology, of course.
Esos indicadores de riesgo que nos permiten ir mucho más, de manera más precisa, a donde hay riesgos de corrupción. Eso en primer lugar. En segundo lugar, cambiando el proceso. Esto parece un poco aburrido, un poco técnico lo que voy a decir, pero si tú haces una auditoría donde te demoras una cantidad de meses o incluso años en entregar un reporte, vas a llegar muy tarde. Pero a partir de nuestra experiencia en la Junta de Auditores de Naciones Unidas, donde la auditoría se hace de otra manera, nosotros lo que entregamos ahora es lo que se llama una management letter, que habiendo avanzado muy poco la auditoría, le entregamos inmediatamente a la administración, le decimos, estos son tus errores y esto tienes que manejarlo. Y eso ha dado muy buenos resultados, por lo menos desde el punto de vista de las compras en materia de COVID, de residencias sanitarias y de construcción de infraestructura, nos ha permitido prevenir y mejorar errores que se habían venido cometiendo. Como te digo, esa es nuestra experiencia. No te puedo decir que vaya a servir para todos los casos, pero por lo menos acá ha servido. Eso.
Muchísimas gracias. Let's see, I have so many follow-up questions also for all of you, but perhaps Ed, coming back to the World Bank and your perspective and experience working in development cooperation, we see that the COVID crisis is affecting strongly inequality and poverty, reverting sometimes success made in previous years. What challenges for development cooperation do you see, and are there perhaps also opportunities to make things different in the future? What do you think? You're on mute.
Thanks, Frederick. I think the international community has a lot to learn from this crisis. I mean, the World Bank is part of that international community, but I think this will apply to all the development bodies or organizations across the world. I think we've seen how the countries are very well connected, and a problem or an issue in one country kind of more closely can become a bigger issue in the rest of the world and affect other countries as well. We saw that in the financial crisis, but I think that was more limited to a certain number of countries. But we've seen what crisis can lead to. Now, the kind of numbers we are, the estimates we are getting is that you might have anything between 10, 15 million people already being pushed back into poverty, okay, as a result of the pandemic. And the pandemic is not over, because you see the new waves coming in a big way in a number of big countries as well. So really an issue. I think it's all kind of boiled down to how do we learn from this crisis and then do development work differently. But the learning, I don't think is just going to be only for international organizations, but it's also for governments as well, to learn from this crisis and see how they do business differently going forward. So, I mean, if I may just say, the World Bank is currently working on an important project, which we call the future of government. And essentially what then we are trying to do is, governments have had a lot of experience on challenges and so on and so forth for years. We've seen the current crisis and the damage it can have on development. Then what really can we learn from it? And how should government do things differently going forward? Okay, in terms of the role it plays, how it manages, how it delivers, how it interacts with citizens and so on and so forth. So that is a piece of work that within the next 6 to 12 months, we will be delivering, so that countries and other partners also can be able to learn from that and be able to engage with governments, and also for governments also to learn from.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to come back also, and this is related also to what you said, the challenge of mainstreaming, let's say, integrity policies in government in different sectors, as mentioned by Angela, in organization, to really ensure that what is in place is actually implemented. Because what we also see that in many countries, the laws are in place, even as Juan Pablo said, there may be tools for engaging citizens, but engagement is not really taking place. So I think, and this is something I heard in all of your interventions, a big challenge is also to ensure that all measures are implemented correctly. Perhaps this could lead us to a final round of key messages, key lessons you would like to emphasize based on your experience, based on your perspectives. And perhaps let's start in the same order as we just had. Señor Contralor, si quiere empezar con algunas palabras de conclusión.
Ok, gracias Frederic. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer que me hayan invitado a participar de este panel. Muchas gracias a mis colegas de panel también y a ti por tu moderación. ¿Qué quisiera dejar como un pensamiento final? Yo creo algo que tú acabas de decir. Mainstreaming the fight against corruption. O sea que la lucha contra la corrupción debemos transversalizarla en todo ámbito de la cuestión pública, de la actividad pública, en el ámbito judicial, en el Congreso Nacional, en el Parlamento y en la administración pública también. Para eso, obviamente, es necesario hacer alianzas, donde todos tienen que estar representados, también la sociedad civil. En segundo lugar, desde el punto de vista de una EFS, de una Supreme Audit Institution como la Contraloría, nosotros pensamos que podemos aportar a reconstruir la confianza pública si entregamos información confiable. Si nosotros hacemos bien nuestro trabajo, la información que entreguemos va a servir para que el gobierno y las administraciones tomen decisiones estratégicas de buena calidad. Y eso va a ayudar a reconstruir algo que está muy en el suelo, por lo menos en este país, que es la confianza en la autoridad. En el caso de Chile estamos enfrentando, o vamos a enfrentar un momento muy crucial de la historia, porque va a empezar un momento de discusión de la nueva Constitución. Y creo que para esa nueva Constitución es necesario que se reconstruya la confianza entre todos los sectores. Eso es lo que puedo decir por ahora. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Jorge. Sí, eso es un momento único, ¿no? En Chile, una gran oportunidad de repensar muchas cosas y tomar en cuenta esas lecciones, ¿no? Juan Pablo, por favor.
Thank you also for the opportunity. I've enjoyed very much this discussion, and I have also benefited for so many points of coincidence. I can make reference to a study that IBP, the International Budget Partnership, and others put together a few years ago about what triggers deep fiscal transparency reforms. And you can count on the one hand, political transitions as one of the factors that triggers these. Fiscal and economic crisis is another one. Widely publicized cases of corruption has always also been behind the push for fiscal transparency reforms, and external influences that promote global norms and empower domestic reformers and civil society actors also. Now, colleagues, in this terrible pandemic, in many cases, all of them are present. And in most countries, at least 2 or 3 of them are present, which means, again, that we are really before a time of profound change regarding basically the relationship between citizens and their authorities. And there we have to be, as we have been, almost without sleeping, to make sure that these agendas move forward with the international cooperation that you mentioned, with the convincing of governments, but again, very strongly with the engagement of, after all, the taxpayers, civil society, the public who owns public resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juan Pablo. Ed, please.
Okay. Thank you, Frederick. So I will just make 3 quick points. The first one is we are going to need strong collaboration among the international community going forward. And the UN Convention Against Corruption provides a good basis for that collaboration. So countries or governments have signed on to the convention. So it's a good basis for the international community to engage. Second, citizens must recognize the impact of corruption on their lives and that their continuing engagement and action will be critical to tackling the challenge. That is in addition to all other efforts that are needed, international community, government, everybody. And thirdly and finally, more efforts are needed to capture what works in what context, and then disseminating this. I think UNODC can play a good role in that. We tried to do something like that recently when we capture lessons in terms of what have worked in different sectors with different tools, and we published that as a global report on anti-corruption last year. I think we need to do more of that and make that available to citizens and also practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. And I saw Angela nodding in agreement.
Yeah, because I saw that report. Because I saw that report and I thought it was great. I thought, wow, what a great report on corruption. Because you know, in UNODC we have a lot of global report on, as Frederick mentioned at the beginning, on drugs every year. We don't have a global report on corruption. So when I saw the World Bank report, I thought, wow, what an interesting, and also to be so specific and so useful. So yeah, that's why I was nodding, because I think, so my point, I think the point that has been mentioned, and just to conclude, that was mentioned repeatedly today, is international cooperation. And I think I mentioned already UNCAC as a key instrument, so I don't have to repeat it. Maybe I just add also the key role of the review mechanism. As in a way a mechanism of peer pressure, if I can use it, because the other point that I want to make is to think about how to to overcome this chronic issue that it is to understand what are the incentives to no corruption. And to really think more and more on incentives of single institution, state to non-corruption. And in that sense, that the peer pressure can help give some of these incentives, not all. And the last point that I want to make is, of course, is measurement. And, you know, even in terms of SDGs, we know if today we are more or less violent than yesterday. So we know if we are making progress or not. And on corruption, there is that frustration to continue to say, is it today better than yesterday? Because we talk about for many years, but there is we have nothing that really help us to see. And so to invest also on measurement, as I said earlier, a measurement that probably will not be perfect, because we'll never be able to capture everything and the multitude and the complexity in one or two single measures, but really to find more together as international community to invest. And on that, Ed, if you don't mind, I also wanted to translate the concept of data into international cooperation, and on the World Development Report that the World Bank has just published on data. And there, as a community of statisticians, we put a call for action in the report about the idea of having an international convention on data. And the idea, you know, linking this idea that international cooperation is not only joint effort, is not just extradition, etc., but is also sharing data for good purposes. So with that thought, I conclude. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I subscribe completely. And first of all, I thank you all for your insights and your experiences you shared. And I think the session really emphasized how important it is to address corruption for the SDGs, and in particular in this context of a crisis, where sometimes, and this is also a reality, we hear that in some countries this is relegated for after the crisis. Right now we have other priority. Let's talk about corruption later. No, it's actually about achieving real impact of safeguarding that the measures to address the crisis are actually reaching those who need it and who can generate the impact that are promised. And so to build back to build back better, we definitely need to build back with integrity and involving citizens, but also public servants, businesses, and organized civil society, as has been mentioned in this panel. And definitely more dialogue like today and in the context of the United Nations, the OECD, everywhere, where there's a policy dialogue is definitely bringing us forward in sharing good practices and understanding what works and why, not just copy pasting some experiences from one country to another, but really understanding the context and be inspired by good practices, but not copying. I think this is also a very important point. Then also looking beyond corruption as just a criminal activity. We see that, for instance, undue influence often happens through legal means, like lobbying, which was mentioned by Ed, which is something that is very important to have regulated and controlled, also through transparency and other means. And we are launching on the 20th of May a follow-up report on our OECD recommendation on lobbying. So I'm inviting all you also to participate on this launch. And finally, just as also everybody said, the relevance of data. I think this has been really showed that those countries that have been better prepared in terms of data availability and use of data were able to better manage many of the aspects of the crisis. So investing in better data, administrative data, better surveys, experience and perception of citizens and users of public services definitely will bring us forward and enable better policies. So thank you to all panelists today for your insights and the lessons you have shared. Thank you to the audience from around the world. Thank you also for the organizers of this conference. And stay healthy and take care. And thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, good day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Goodbye.
Merci beaucoup.
Bye-bye.
Merci.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.